So welcome and thanks for being here with us. You are tuning in to the session Second Generation Seeds, Cultivating Relationships Within the Asian Diaspora. This is the 41st Seed Savers Exchange annual conference. It's the second year we're doing it virtually. We are here with Kristyn Leach, and I am so excited to have her here. My name is Jeanine Scheffert. I'm the Education and Engagement Manager here at Seed Savers. We're going to be talking to Kristyn here. Kristyn Leach is a farmer in California's Central Valley. As part of Second Generation Seeds, she grows predominantly Korean and East Asian crops using natural farming methods. In this presentation, Kristyn will highlight Second Generation Seeds, a farmer collaborative working to preserve, adapt, and build upon the traditions and agricultural wisdom of Asian plants and peoples. She will explore Second Generation's partnership with Seed Savers Exchange and examine how our ability to look at, contextualize, and understand the past informs and strengthens our abilities to foster imaginative futures. Kristyn, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Kristyn. She's going to do a presentation. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So Kristyn, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jeanine. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to this, and just excited to share a little about what we're doing and then hopefully have a conversation at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you guys see that?
I can see it. It's not on the presenter view.
Oh, okay. This?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, this is my little farm, and this is where I started farming rather. 10 years ago, I subleased an acre and a half from the farmer who I was working for at the time because I wanted to grow, I wanted to grow Korean crops. I had been growing kingneep and some chame, Korean melons, for a couple years, just as a little bit of a side project. I'm Korean American. I was born in Korea and then grew up here. And so when I finally got to start my own farm and had this, ample space to just grow whatever I wanted, I really, enthusiastically picked up the Kitazawa seed catalog. And I basically just went through there, and anything that said it was Korean or used by Koreans, I just circled it and I ordered the seeds to plant. And so one of the things that I was most excited about was these Korean black soybeans. And so I had just seen them in the catalog amongst other different types of fresh green potted varieties and different dry beans. And so this was a dry bean variety that's used in different kinds of Korean panchan. So I had never lived somewhere before where I could really grow soybeans like this. And so I just really relished the opportunity. And so I grew probably about 600 feet worth of soybeans, and, they're a really long season crop. So 120 days later of weeding and mulching and irrigating them, I cut them. I had to monopolize my employer's greenhouse to dry them all down. We invited all of our friends out to help us thresh these seeds. And when everything was said and done, I had probably about like a little under a 5-gallon bucket's worth of beans. And as a production farmer, I kind of thought, well, this was really enjoyable, but at the end of the day, I'm in California. Land access is super expensive in a pretty prohibitive way. And so when I kind of looked at all this math and trying to figure out for myself, like having a small farm that was going to be a livelihood for me, sadly enough, I was disappointed in the yield that these beans provided. And so for several years, I just didn't grow them again and kind of focused on things that helped me get my farm off the ground and help me just kind of like build some momentum. But luckily for me, soybeans weren't really done with me. And so a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to go to Korea, and the first time I had gone since I was born there, and just spent all of that time with small scale farmers who are also really enthusiastic about natural farming, and people who were really deeply entrenched in the seed sovereignty work that was really inspiring to me. And I went in mid to late October. And so the job that I was doing on everyone's farm was threshing soybeans. And so just for weeks on end, like the first farm I was at is pretty close to the DMZ. And this is the elder Mrs. Che, the sort of farm harmony. And she really taught me a lot about just this thoroughness. Like we would spend the time threshing all these beans with a flail, and then she would follow us, concerned that we weren't thorough enough, and go through and pick through every bush, basically. And she taught me this kind of musicality of being able to differentiate, like me stepping on a dried leaf or the cracking of a stem with the really kind of beautiful melody of like one small bean that's managed to evade the flail that is in one little dried pod that's rattling around. And I think just getting attuned to that was something that I really appreciated, just getting to spend that time with her. And then in the evenings, we would sort the beans. And I was there just trying to, keep up with her. And my language skills aren't that great. And she was talking quite a lot. But it was amazing to watch how nimble her hands moved through these beans. And she quickly sorted it, and trying to learn from her, just to be able to judge, like to know the feeling on your finger, and to know just by a quick glance what was going to be planted for next year, what was going to be made into panchan, what was going to just be steamed with rice. So she was making all of these piles like as quickly as I could kind of even identify what was going on. And so we spent our nights like that, just kind of hunched over this small table, me just trying to learn as much as I could in the few nights that I was there with her. And then I moved on, and the next place I went was a research institute called Huk Salim. And so here they focus on preserving different indigenous varieties of particularly beans and grains from the Korean Peninsula. And their researchers, kind of showed me the wealth of genetics, like with all of these different kinds of soybeans and adzuki beans, like these crops where Korea is one of the centers of domestication and kind of one of the centers of diversity, where we see not just these kind of incredible, beautiful land races that developed regionally, but also like still a wealth of crop wild relatives and kind of bridge crops that were somewhere in between that farmers would keep at the edges of their fields as famine food. So varieties of soy that were still vining and small seeded, more wild varieties, and then these kind of domesticated varieties that had larger seeds. And they showed me all these different kinds of rice. And it just was fairly stunning for me to realize just how naive I felt looking back on my first year of farming, and thinking that the happiness I felt in finding in Kitazawa's catalog, the Korean black soybean, and just feeling like, hey, this is cool. There's a Korean soybean and I'm going to grow it. And then just being presented with this kind of staggering array of all of these different kinds of soybeans, and all of them with these really kind of quirky, affectionate names, like red eye or the scholar bean. And rice varieties that was, oh, that one, that's called the one who sits low, or this is the one with the droopy head. And, really interesting too, to just hear them describe the conditions that farmers faced. For those of you who don't know much about Korea, it's been this long history of Japanese colonialism leading way into the Korean War, and then essentially kind of like a US occupation of the peninsula. And the economic miracle, or what it's considered, of like the late 80s following military dictatorship in Korea, but this kind of rapid economic growth, the opening up of Korea to many sort of bilateral trade agreements, kind of coinciding with Korea being a strategic geopolitical place in terms of places like the US, their strategy in terms of the containment of China. And so all of these things have a huge bearing. Obviously, so much of the population benefited from being really pulled out of the type of poverty that persisted since the Korean War. But by and large, small scale farmers got really left out of that equation, because prices dropped for them. They couldn't compete with cheaper imports. And so this is where suddenly in the 70s and 80s, you see Syngenta and Seminis being kind of the two largest investors in the agricultural sector. And also the two of those companies end up acquiring all of kind of Korean vegetable breeding programs. And so we had this rapid diminishing of all of this beautiful, robust diversity that we had seen, which is very similar to other places that have experienced that kind of export of the Green Revolution and its mentality. So my next stop was also with Ms. Pyun, who works with the Korean Women Peasants Association. And she really didn't mince words. She talked about the impact on poor people and on peasants in Korea. She talked about how hard it was, that the seed keeping work was being done by older generations, and that because of this kind of seductive nature of Western culture, that there just wasn't a lot of ways to make these heirloom varieties really exciting to a lot of young people, and particularly not with multi-generational farms where the economic pressures were just so great, and without the kind of strength in the market for these varieties. A lot of farmers just that I showed these beans and wanted to share them with, lamented about it and were nostalgic about it, but really weren't going to be able to incorporate this into their farm plan. And so all along, this journey, I sat with this idea of just kind of hearing all of these stories, realizing how much I had longed to hear them, and feeling a great responsibility of all the things that I didn't know. Like, I didn't know about this biodiversity, and I didn't know exactly to the degree farmers were struggling in Korea. I acted in a certain way like a greedy production farmer, and I was so quick to give up on these beans when there was something that didn't pencil out for me in terms of the economics. And this experience, if anything, was a very humbling sort of reminder of soybeans coming back into my life and telling me this kind of importance. And so by the end of my time there, I was fortunate enough that a lot of the people that I met and spent this time with trusted me with some of the beans that they were closest to. And so all three of these beans are just kind of have different names, but they're all broadly classified as chestnut beans or pamkong. And it's just a very straightforward name because they're predominantly just steamed with rice, and they do impart a really strong chestnut flavor to whatever you're cooking. And so, they had given me basically, between 10 and 30 beans of each of these varieties and a couple other varieties. I brought them back to the US, and the next year I grew them. And I've just never been so relieved, I've never spent so much time just staring at soil, like feeling like I was willing something to grow. I've never felt that level of devotion in terms of just like keeping all different creatures that love to eat these really nutritious plants at bay. And so that first year I managed to grow probably 75 feet's worth of these beans. And just saved every single one, even the cracked ones, even the small ones, everything was just set aside to plant the next year. And the next year I managed to grow probably about 400 feet's worth of all these different varieties. And then the year after that, with saving all of those seeds, I managed to grow like over 900 feet's worth of space. And now today on my farm, I grow about a quarter acre of these mixed soybeans. And I build a fence for them just because the first year when we moved the farm, we didn't realize how big the jackrabbit populations were. And so we just built this little enclosure for them to protect them. And I've, shed many a tear over just kind of getting these beans to make it through, again, like over 100 days of the season. And even in a year like this, where we're really concerned about our water running out in California, we've been dealing with lots of groundwater quality issues. As each day is this process of kind of triaging and figuring out like a scenario plan for all of these different options and thinking about what crops we'll let go of or how we can kind of manage like a seed saving regimen within what's happening. definitely one of the North Stars is making sure that these beans, are going to have what they need to make it through till November when we harvest the seeds. And so I figured in this presentation, why not start with a long-winded tribute to soybeans, who I think are very misunderstood and very maligned. And part of that is due to the fact that this is a photo from one of the largest expeditions that the USDA sponsored, the Dorset and Morse expedition. And that main purpose was that in the early 1900s, soybean was seen as, and this is a quote from their report, a virtually unknown Oriental curiosity, but with promise as forage and industrial fuel uses. And so these two agronomists had gone to China, Korea, and Japan. And in about 30 years and multiple expeditions in the 1920s, they had managed to collect over 7,000 accessions of soybean from East Asia. And, it was put into breeding programs, and some of the first really kind of big vegetable breeding programs around the US was actually devoted to soybean. And, while Dorset and Morse actually were really interested in the soybean as a food for human consumption, by and large, the breeding programs they were put into were really not that interested in tofu or soy sauce and things like that. And so, what we have now is you have that idea, these 7,000 accessions taken by the government from all of these different farmers. And now today, the North American gene pool of soybeans reflects about 19 of those land races. And so it's an incredible bottleneck that happened really rapidly and has resulted in soybean, being essentially kind of a villain in this global stage. We associate it with the deforestation of the Amazon and, this kind of chemicals leaching into the watersheds leading into the Gulf and all of these different things, and glyphosate and perils to public health. Or even when, we see something positive in the news about it, it might be because we can extract something in their roots to make like a really expensive veggie burger or something. But it's never about, the stories that I got to hear. And I thought that with you as this captive audience right now, if I could have a chance to redeem soybean to even some of you, and to get to profess a little bit of my love, because I think that soybean is just this great example of how crops become unwillingly entangled in some of the biggest kind of broadest global stories that we have, and that those stories are upholding like all of these different systems and approaches and cosmologies. But within all of those stories are actually like a much more interesting myriad, collectivist stories of all the people that tended to these different land races, and how soy is not only just this incredibly nutritious food and this cornerstone of a food culture. In Korea alone, we have different ways of fermenting it, different ways of eating it, but it's just such a robust part of how these plants really evolved and that biodiversity flourished in response to the food culture being shaped by each other. And so, and it also to me is a testament of just, as different farming technologies are exported around the world, like soybeans also speak to me in terms of like just reminding me of the wisdom of like the farmers who came before me, because they played such a valuable role in these, no input systems and these natural farming methods that, didn't have access to other types of fertility. So soybeans were a really integral part of crop rotation and intercropping plans, and as a way of sustaining agriculture for centuries. And so for me, I just wanted to start there because I feel like it's just important to acknowledge the sort of sense of like a multiverse that exists within each crop, and how attached it is to these different worldviews, and how important it is to, to consider that. And I think that for us, obviously a lot of people who care about the work Seed Savers Exchange does, we understand the importance of in situ conservation. And we understand like all of those 7,000 beans being held by the USDA and really just only analyzing them for crude oil content and protein is such a disservice. It doesn't tell you what is for panchan, or what is for tofu, or what is for soy sauce, or what is for doenjang. And the narrowness of that perspective, and the narrowness of like having, biodiversity being kept without any cultural diversity or any diversity of perspective, where it's all along some one axis that is in service of a bigger industrialized system, was really part of why we wanted to start Second Generation. And so, a couple years into my farming, I started doing field trials for Kitazawa Seed Company, because they wanted to see how some of the varieties that were being bred in Asia or by Asian seed companies in the States performed for small organic farmers. And after a couple years of getting to know the owners and getting to know the catalog, they were willing to entertain me and some of the more wild musings about the state of seed, and allowed me to start a seed line within their company called Second Generation that would really focus on heirloom varieties, and that would also just look to kind of support the communities that are really attached to those varieties. So we started a small seed line to just kind of at first promote, for me, a lot of Korean varieties that would be separate from the seed industry that was really kind of monopolized by these bigger multinational companies. So for us, like, this idea of in situ is not just about having those seeds learning and growing from year to year and not in just the sort of seed bank in isolation, but also caring for them in context and in this sense of right relationship. So just understanding that if we don't really understand the context that shaped these plants to have the unique traits and unique genetic makeup that they have, we can't necessarily know like what to foster. We just have a huge blind spot in terms of moving forward without ever taking the time to understand. And I think a lot of the expeditions that did go to Asia and different types of seed tourism that still exist today, never consult with communities about how it's used or how they really care for them, or all the stories and associations people have to them that are quite meaningful. And so it's just prone to lots of speculation and a lot of inconsistencies. And it's not to say like who can and can't grow something, but we just want to make sure that for us, our seed keeping efforts are informed by and continually accountable to the communities that have stewarded them. Just because it also imbues those seeds with so much joy to be processed, like you see here on our farm, with people who are passing on those stories and laughing and spending this time together, and that these plants get to play a role that I think that they really enjoy, which is to bring people together, and which is to kind of keep culture alive. And I think for a lot of communities in these various diasporas, we sometimes think of tradition as something that's a relic, or at best we're trying to preserve it through reproducing it. But I feel like just spending time with these plants has given me a lot more permission than I've ever felt to keep them alive in more dynamic ways, because the plants are learning to evolve and they're learning to adapt to very different circumstances than where they've lived for generations. And so it just sort of models for us, like, if they can be flexible and adaptive, then maybe we're allowed to be too. So we started a program called Seed Stewards within Second Generation, which works together with farmers on a year-long program where farmers highlight a crop that they're doing a seed project around. And that project can either be, variety trials, seed increases, culinary evaluations / cultural evaluations, adaptation and improvement, or breeding new varietals. And so they pick a crop or crop family that they're going to highlight during one of the months of the program. And we kind of build a community around that to, again, preserve, perpetuate, and evolve our traditions. And so we managed this as a small pilot last year through our CSA. So using the CSA, like a community supported agriculture, a weekly veggie box, as a way to basically create more participatory processes for families and individuals to be involved in all sorts of seed keeping practices, And so beyond being kind of the consumers of the food, we were able to use the boxes to kind of send out different varieties, and then provide an educational component that basically let them give input into shaping like our seed saving practices. And again, like I'm speaking to all of this as a Korean American, but also as someone who grew up as an outsider for the most part to Korean culture for a lot of my life. And so I'm not claiming to have the expertise to make me a gatekeeper of that culture. And in some ways, that outsiderness really made me feel as a farmer, this push to, venture out of my shell and really find Korean American community, because I was growing all of these Korean crops, but I didn't have that tether. I didn't have the nostalgia or sentimentality or just kind of like that immediate sense memory of opening ground chili peppers and smelling it and being transported somewhere. Like, so I wanted to seek that out, and I realized that that was my role. If I could play a role meaningfully as someone who's connecting to my culture through seed, the best way for me to be accountable to those plants is to also to reunite them with people who really are familiar with them. And so that's what a lot of the motivation has been. So our group tries to foster intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue. So we bring together different communities of the Asian diaspora, different Swana communities from North Africa and West Asia, to kind of just share so something like summer squash or things that are eaten as summer squash. We have farmers growing different varieties. Like for Korea, we have ehobak, which is a cucurbita moschata, eaten as a young squash. And we have a Palestinian farmer growing her kusa variety, which is cucurbita pipo. We have other people growing, kind of classic zucchinis, and we have others growing gourds, like oppo, that are also eaten as summer squash. So we get to see this combination of like all of the different culinary applications and how the preparation and people's relationship to it led to these really interesting ways that different varieties started to evolve. And our community gets to learn and develop a language around understanding and assessing these different traits and phenotypes and genotype. But in that sharing, it becomes quite meaningful, because the difference between kusa and ehobak, like if I was just growing kusa and being prepared to just make it the way that I make ehobak, I might prefer ehobak. But if I prepared it in the way that Nadia, like of Thuraya Farm is telling me, they prepared in Palestine, then it might finally click for me. Like, oh, but yeah, kusa, like I couldn't use ehobak to make these types of stuffed kusa dishes that they're making. And so I think it's just a very fertile ground for people to feel really proud of the food culture that raised them, and also for us to like relate that back to plant biology and genetics and evolution and all of these things. And so we also just want to build practical skills. So we do a lot of things around just teaching basic plant biology, teaching hands-on seed saving. And so families do get tasked with learning things. We send overripe fruits home and then host monthly potlucks where we all together learn how to save the seeds of these different fruits. We host field days on the farm where people can come and learn about these processes more. And again, it's also just for me as a small scale seed grower, there's an idea of efficiency, and we don't have a lot of high tech seed cleaning equipment on the farm. We have some screens, and we have our friends. And so we build in this time to not just see one role for efficiency being kind of, me alone independently being able to do more, but like, how can the process of seed keeping like also bring us together and have us spend time together, just getting to talk and get to know each other and keep abreast of everybody's lives. So the practical skills are a big part of that as well. And these are all the things that we're looking to kind of build relationships with Seed Savers Exchange, just because, they've granted us access to a lot of the different varieties that originate in Asia, where there is sometimes incomplete information, or things are just picked up, like someone was at a market or someone informally shared it. And some of the stories have kind of, dropped out somewhere along the line. And so we have our network of growers that are able to grow those. and then plug it through our program like Seed Stewards, where then our community is doing interviews like this, where, you know, the kids are tasked with finding, like, you know, that auntie that cooks really good food, or the uncle who has a really good garden, or community member or friend that is always, you know, raving about a certain crop. And yeah, for them to like learn to contextualize it. So we asked them just very simple questions about their memories about these crops, how they describe the flavor, you know, what do they deem as important things to know about this plant, and, you know, why do you think this plant holds such a special place in our hearts? And then they learn usually how to cook it. And there's just ways that the kids end up exchanging information to prepare these different foods. And that's been meaningful in a different way too, in terms of just addressing like diet and health for young people, which is especially important to us, just because a lot of the communities we work with, you know, some of those communities experience really disproportionate health outcomes. And a lot of times it's just seen as like, oh, these communities don't really, you know, need help understanding what's healthy. And we wanted to get back to the story of like, our communities know how to stay healthy. Sometimes that's hard because lifestyle is prohibitive or economically inaccessible. Sometimes our communities have been really dispossessed of that knowledge and right to stay healthy through lots of different means. And so we want kids to really embrace this idea that it is actually their inheritance is good health and fortitude. And for me, as someone doing a CSA, like, it's also been really practically helpful because, you know, we have different things that families have said, like, if we just got this in a CSA box and we didn't have this community element, you know, maybe at first pass, some of the kids wouldn't like it. And we probably would just honestly, you know, not take it again, or we'd compost it. But because within our group, even if you aren't familiar with something or don't like it at first, there's lots of people that are super excited about it and sharing these stories and sharing recipes and pictures that just make things look so mouthwatering and delicious. So yeah, one of our biggest successes, I think, is, you know, we highlighted bitter melon last year in October, and it just became this kind of runaway hit where families are like, whoa, our 6-year-old is really sad that we ran out of bitter melon this week. Like, can you load us up for next week? And so the fact that children are now clamoring for something that is, you know, a pretty hard sell for people that didn't grow up with it sometimes, of bitter melon, I definitely consider it a success. And a lot of that is just really due to the horizontal nature of all of this sharing. So yeah, we make up activities for kids. Like, for this month, we're highlighting different forms of Perilla. And so we just challenged all of them to, you know, Perilla bingo, where if they can complete any 3 of these missions, that gives them a, you know, successful bingo run, then we give them a prize. And if people can, you know, go all out and do all 9, they'll get a really special prize. And so these are part of workbooks that we work with an illustrator. Emily Yao has designed these really beautiful, engaging books that are really fun and geared towards young people with games and coloring activities and puzzles. But at the same time, actually have a lot of information. So for Perilla, you know, we wanted to highlight, you know, break apart this idea that Perilla is all of it's just shiso called by a different name. And really show how different all of those different chemotypes are within the genus, and how different it was, whether people were selecting for oil seed types or leaves that were used for culinary and medicinal purposes. And so the coloring book gives us a way to like have people sharpen that act of noticing and realize that Tieto is different from Kenip, is different from Shiso, and why, and really have them be able to embrace that. And so one of the other things that we've been doing with Seed Savers Exchange is, just kind of this exchange of information. And last year we highlighted chili peppers. And so one of the interesting things for me was, chili pepper is something that in Korea, it was actually developments in pepper breeding was what really enticed Seminists to purchase the 2 main vegetable breeding programs in Korea in the late 80s. And because they had figured out how to breed male sterile lines to expedite hybrid breeding. And so a lot of the peppers that we end up having shared with us, or we see in the Korean market, and the peppers that, again, pepper is a highly nostalgic crop. But all of that is really rooted in intellectual property. And that was a big thing for farmers that I met, was how do we contend with that when what people associate as this source of national pride is really linked to, not really benefiting Korean farmers as a whole. And so when we got the opportunity to grow out different peppers that came to Seed Savers Exchange via like a government seed bank and then through some different individuals, it was really interesting process for us to kind of see the variability that was there. And then our hopes are just, if we see things that have gone a little awry, that, we can kind of keep that tethered and then involve our communities in this participatory breeding program. And so the pepper that's right here, these kind of thin peppers, were labeled as Korean hot. And that is actually something that you can see in a number of other seed catalogs offered. And from what we can surmise, it's essentially what in Korea is called Cheongyang pepper, which is a hybrid between a Jeju Island variety and then Southeast Asian, a Thai pepper. And it's become this like wildly successful branded thing. And for us, like we grew it was pretty variable from the seeds that we received. But it seems like an interesting possibility to kind of like bring that back into this community relationships and have community shape it from here on out. And it feels like for us, like possibly this reclamation from, that kind of bigger imperialist system. And so that's what's been really exciting for us as growers. The 5 farmers that we work with through second generation, just really excited about Seed Savers Exchange, like having the vision to recognize like this type of collaboration now and the sharing of resources, and for that community wisdom and community input to actually be seen as a resource is something very unique in terms of just recognizing, even in our best efforts, the role that gatekeeping has played and how it hasn't necessarily ever really cared to get input from more diverse communities. And so we want to work against just the idea of like, the individual seed heroes and kind of come up with like a truly grassroots response to it. We've gotten to collaborate with Seed Savers Exchange. We also work, I saw Mehmet from 2 Seeds in a Pod is in here, and he's a close friend and collaborator, and he's part of Seed Stewards as well. It's just incredibly inspiring for us. We're focusing on the crops that are really important, from our different ancestral lands. We're really concerned with, kind of having these conversations that look at kind of trade liberalization and its impact on food systems and farmers, like in lots of parts of Asia. And we always want to bridge that with other forms of like struggle for racial justice and kind of working with other BIPOC communities to kind of support the work that everybody's doing. And just thinking, particularly for where I am in California, even though we're in a lot of peril this year, we're also in what is generally a good seed growing climate. And so just trying to think about ways that we can share and exchange seeds. And again, not say that, my Korean seeds only need to be grown by my Korean community, but just to say like, it always needs to be part of a conversation. And they're just, all of this is an effort in trust building and recognizing that, that's been ruptured in lots of cases. And so just trying to rebuild from there. So that's pretty much all that I had to kind of present. And we can have a conversation, I guess, from here.
Thank you so much, Kristyn. It's always so inspiring to hear about your work. And, on behalf of Seed Savers, I would just want to say that it's an honor to be working with you and collaborating. And, we're learning a lot as well through this. So thank you for that. So anyone who does want to ask any questions, feel free to raise your hand. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says reactions. And if you click on that, you can click on raise your hand, and then I'll see the computer will tell me that you have a question and I can call on you. You can also put questions in the chat and I can read them from there. So we do have a couple of questions that have already come in. One of the questions is, You talked about which soybeans are best for what dishes, and you mentioned the dish banchan. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. And the question just is, can you describe what banchan is?
Oh, yeah. So banchan is basically, like if you've ever eaten at a Korean restaurant, it's all the elaborate array of small dishes that usually come out. And so, yeah, a lot of eating in Korea is very communal. And so you usually have like rice and then like a number of side dishes. So banchan is just, yeah, essentially a side dish that is prepared and served usually with like a little stew and some rice.
Great, thank you. And then you're growing a lot of, you're in California and you're growing things that originated in Korea. What are the growing conditions? How do they compare in California and in Korea?
Well, we get a lot less rain, obviously. Korea, has very hot, humid summer with a monsoon season. And so it is very different. And then the winter is pretty severe as well. So there were definitely challenges, but I think in some regards, like the direction that we took, which is to take, seeds grown in, this kind of much more moist conditions and then grow it in our Mediterranean climate, aside from having to deal with a lot more heat and drought, like in some ways, like those, we have less disease pressure. So we can't necessarily help in a lot of regards to those types of pressures that farmers are facing, but we are able to, because everything is being selected along these lines, like looking at heat and drought as our main stressors and extreme heat, like we've had 110 degrees since April, basically. And so in a lot of regards, like that is rising temperatures, more days of extreme heat is something that's affecting a lot of crop loss for Korean farmers. And so that is something that I do feel like our style, like, land-raised breeding, traditional breeding, is really well suited to kind of meet the needs of small scale farmers and peasants back in Korea faster than the industrial response can be, right? Because it's not looking at single or dual traits for heat and drought. So that's been like an exciting area where it's like, okay, like everybody, for me here and for Korean farmers there, like are being exposed to, higher temperatures and some more irregular rain patterns. And so we can kind of, participate in that to share back something kind of meaningful.
Yeah, that's great. We have a comment from Penn here. Penn says she's blown away. She's growing soybeans at 8,000 feet, very short season, and wondering if you met any farmers at altitudes, and are there short season varieties of these soybeans?
Yeah, first of all, I think that's just really amazing. And I'd love to see, like pictures of the beans that you're able to grow. Because I always get so curious too, because basically soybeans and perilla have dictated where I cannot ever live, and so because they have this distinct latitudinal range. And for me and my partner, we always struggled. I lived in the Pacific Northwest for a long time when I was younger and farmed there and always thought I would go back. And my partners from California, they're always like, what's going to happen? Like, I feel really called back to Washington. And after I got those beans, I just remember sitting with my friends in Korea and being like, I don't know, like, do you think Jenny will be like happy or sad that now that these beans are here, we have to stay in California? Like, will she just be relieved that we're going to stay here? Or is she going to be mad that, all her reasons for staying in California weren't good enough, but now these beans are guide the rest of our lives? But I do think there are short season varieties. I met some farmers who, again, were kind of at the border between, the manufactured border of Korea, and they grew some varieties that were like just smaller seeded, which I think had a slightly shorter season. I didn't go anywhere that was super high altitude. But again, like I think there are some farmers like in other parts of more northern China that some of that diversity is there. And again, you'll find them as mostly like kind of smaller seeded. And I think some of the wild varieties too actually have like a really different rate of maturation. And I know, I'm not sure if Penn is growing them for fresh eating or dry beans, because there are a number of early varieties that you can just eat the fresh pods that are more suitable for really short season climates. And so, yeah, a lot of the kind of yellow seeded varieties, there's some brown seeded varieties that, you know, probably are short enough because they plump up pretty early. You probably have a long enough window to at least save seeds from, even if they're not consumed as a dry bean. But feel free to email, because I can think on this a little bit more. And yeah, some other friends more in the Northwest have asked similar questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
In your presentation, you talked about coming to a point in your life where you wanted to connect with the Korean culture and the Korean American culture, and it was a culture that you felt kind of outside of until this point. Once you decided that was important to you, how did you make that connection?
Well, yeah, kind of begrudgingly, just because I do think, you know, like I was adopted when I was an infant. And so, and just didn't really grow up around a lot of other Korean people, and kind of almost like pushed against it a little bit just because I didn't want to feel very different. And so, and then, you know, like in my adult life, like where I lived in Washington, it was like there were Korean community, but it felt just very vulnerable because I couldn't speak the language very well. So plants were always like the way that I could navigate that, and it was private and it was something I could do on my own. And I just would grow these plants, and I would feel this sense of like, you know, reading about them or reading recipes and knowing intellectually like, oh, this is like something Koreans eat. And then getting to spend time with them, like I did feel like something did click, where it was like, oh, you're familiar in this way that is kind of deeper. And again, like I think that it did feel more vulnerable, but I think, yeah, with Perilla, for example, I was like, I've never actually had someone prepare this for me. And I love it for all these reasons. Like, I think it's botanically just like really stunning. I love being in its company, but I don't know the first thing about, you know, if I start tasting leaves and seeing some variation in flavor, like this is such a sentimental crop. Like I would bring baskets to events and things, people would just stuff their face in it and yeah, have that ratatouille moment where they're just brought to like a specific memory in their grandmother's garden. And so I just felt like, well, I've got to, you know, start bringing this out just so that I know I'm not accidentally selecting away from things that then I bring it to someone and it's sort of unrecognizable to them because it's so kind of culturally important. So then when I started my farm, I lived in the Bay Area, and there was just a ton of like really inspiring, lots of different types of Korean American community. And so I just had reached out to like the Korean Senior Center, and my farm in the beginning, like we had a contract, or we still do have a contract with a restaurant group in San Francisco that's owned by 3 Korean brothers. And, you know, since we had that contract, like some of the excess that we had in the first few years, they had agreed that I could just like, you know, sell at other places. And I decided to just end up donating it through the Asian Women's Shelter. And they had a program specifically for Korean Americans. And so we started doing programming with them. It was called Korean American Coalition to End Domestic Abuse. And we started hosting them for events on the farm to just sort of say like, instead of just having your time together, be talking about something that's arguably like the most traumatic experience you've had in your life. Let's just come together and talk about food, and we'll show you these plants on the farm and we'll prepare, you know, like a potluck. And then just all the things that I think all of us know, like about how food is this sort of backdoor into letting people talk about the hard stuff and not feeling like, you know, the pressure to just do that. But it's like one thing leads to another. So it was just kind of seeking out through Korean organizations. But then a lot of those people that have been involved with that have just become, they just suddenly wanted to show up at the farm all the time. Like a lot of elders in the community just like unannounced would come and they'd be like, you know, I'm just going to weed, you know, you don't even have to talk to me. I brought you some lunch. It's over under the tree.
Oh, wow.
And so it was like people, I was very fortunate because I did live in an area where there was, you know, substantial community, and that community was like really, really responsive and really supportive. So very quickly, just like having a farm of even my small scale when I started, and I'm only on about 4 acres now, but still it's kind of like people mail seeds, you know, with letters and things like that. So I just started going to events and being the weird person that was like, I'm here and I brought this box of chame, you know, like who doesn't like the person that comes with lots of delicious fruit? So yeah, it felt like they were the friend that was willing to come with me to these things and be that kind of bridge and ambassador, basically. Yeah, and I remember like going to the Korean Senior Center and having that awkward moment where I always bring perilla seedlings for them each year. And it's like, you know, I walk in the door the first time and they're all talking really excited at me. And I was like, I can't really understand. And I mostly only speak English. And, you know, the very senior, like disapproving, like, oh, you just American, you don't care about your roots. And then I was like, I was adopted. And then they all just feel bad and guilty. But then it was like just being able to share those seedlings and yeah, just finding a way to communicate basically. So I do feel like it just, all these plants gave me this buffer where I was like, you know, at times of existential crisis, you just wonder like, what am I contributing back to like the lineage that I'm from? And yeah, like I think because I had skills from working on farms since I was really young, I was like, well, this is something very practical I can do. Like I have a skill set that is useful in terms of making sure like the stories and perspectives of my people continue on. And so I've just gotten to learn and benefit way more from that, but be the one bringing kind of like the nerdy science perspective to it. And yeah, just sharing food.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. And we have a question here from Mehmet. Mehmet is saying, could you please explain what your understanding of landrace is? And can landrace varieties be bred without community involvement?
I mean, my understanding of landrace is, yeah, it's just the ways that, you know, varieties became distinct with this kind of prolonged contact with different farmers in different communities. And so, yeah, like with soybean, it's something that like is a cultigen. It was like really born and evolved within a domesticated relationship. And so I think land races, like in some regards, represent a genetic bottleneck. And so to your question of if community needs to be involved, like I do believe so, just because, yeah, because it represents this bottleneck. In order to keep it healthy and vigorous and evolving, like in some ways it will need to change. And so again, it's wanting to liberate us from this idea that culture is a thing of the past and tradition is a thing of the past, and to just, yeah, like breathe this new life into it each year. And I think in order to do that with some amount of integrity, we have to think of that continuum, and we have to think about the past, not to just reproduce it in perpetuity, but to have that really inform, yeah, this like whole understanding of how we see these plants, yeah, as their whole selves, basically. And I think that that's been the thing that's been compelling is to just see people become more of their whole selves in that relationship too. And when it's just like, oh, we have these crops that have these long relationships with our communities, like what that reunion feels like, you see it just change. You see it change both plant and human communities. And so I think it's not just about like maintaining the trueness of the seed, but thinking about how different our world would be if people got to live in those relationships and feel like their vibrance and feel that permission to kind of like not be trapped in just the violence of what has dispossessed you of that knowledge or dispossessed you of your land and community historically, but to think about that reunification and the making things whole, basically.
That's such a beautiful answer. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I could keep talking to you forever, but our time is up. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your stories. It's been really beautiful. I don't know if you can see all the love coming through the chat here, but so many compliments and thank you. It's really appreciated. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Jeanine. Good to see you.
You too.